When I was in college, I took some courses in the theater because I was interested in it. And some of these courses, the requirement was to look at some well-known plays and read them and evaluate them and critique them and try to learn from how they were written what constitutes a good play. So it was a rather interesting approaching them from that standpoint. Also learned a term from one of those courses called pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy. And it was used to describe how moods are established to add to the dramatic illusion of different plays. They're done with music or weather or both. For example, those of you who remember back, and the reason I mention this example, because most everyone has seen The Sound of Music at one time or the other, but it starts with Julie Andrews out in this beautiful green meadow in the Swiss Alps, and she's twirling around and singing this beautiful, the theme song for the movie. Well, that just automatically establishes a great mood. I mean, it's uplifting, it's cheerful, and so it helps prepare you for what's ahead. Conversely, if you see a play or a movie where it's a dark, dreary, rainy night with thunder and lightning, and you see the shadow of a figure surreptitiously going through the house with a knife raised up, and you just see the shadow every once in a while and the lightning flashes, or a revolver, you know that something's happening. It creates a sense of foreboding, you know, and it's a prelude to what's going to happen next. Well, if any of you that's seen silent films, the piano player, where they had a piano player, same type of effect, that the music was created to establish moods. We also, in these various courses, learned about the word hypocrite and the word hypocrisy, which comes from the Greek hypokrisis. The acting out, the play acting that is done by the actor in portraying and interpreting a part or a role. Nowadays, we don't usually think of that term in the classical sense as used in the theater. We tend to think of the word hypocrite, of someone who is two-faced, someone who believes or espouses one thing, promotes a certain thing, has certain opinions or ideas, but they don't really believe them because their actions don't dovetail by the things that they say. You know, they might denounce something publicly, but privately indulge in it. It happens when someone, for example, will attack pornography and is very much against it. And then a few days later, you happen to see him furtively looking around coming out of an adult store. I mean, it's that type of thing. They say one thing, they want you to believe one thing, but their actions don't demonstrate the same thing. They're usually diametrically opposed and opposite. I had a boss once who, as a matter of factly, told a group of us in a meeting one time. He was a new manager. We'd acquired him as a result of a merger, and we got him from another organization. But he told a group of us one time, he said, you know, I'm an elitist. Of course, that grabbed our attention. It got my attention because I'd never heard anyone come out and say something like that. So naturally, I wanted to hear what else he had to say. Usually people don't flaunt that type of thing in front of you. However, if you looked at his record before joining our organization and before he got in the financial industry, in a way, there was some credibility to his statement, because at age 30, he was the youngest, age 32, he was the youngest athletic director ever hired by the University of Washington. And one of his very first acts the next year, in 1957, was to hire Jim Owens, who, those of you remembering back to those days, created an 18-year dynasty for the Huskies. And 2 years later, in 1960, they went to the Rose Bowl and shellacked Wisconsin 44-8. First win over a Big Ten team. So I guess in thinking about what he said, there was some credibility to it. But the one thing about him, you always knew where you stood. You knew what he was, you knew how he thought, but there were never any surprises. He may have been an elitist, but he never could be accused of being a hypocrite. In Matthew 15, verse 7, those of you who are looking the scriptures up, Matthew 15, verse 7, Christ talks about hypocrites. And here he says, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people, they draw nigh unto me with their mouth." They say, we really love God. We really love the Lord. We love his commandments. We love this and that. With their mouth, a hypocrite says something like that. But their heart is far from me. And the reason you know their heart is far from God is that at some point in time, the real person will emerge, and what they say does not dovetail with their actions. They think highly of their strengths, their achievements, and they overlook their weaknesses and their failures. Verse 9, "But in vain do they worship me." You may think, or they think they're going through the motions of worship, but the way God looks at it, that's all they are, motions. "In vain do they worship me, teaching, either verbally or by their example, since actions do speak louder than words, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." Not teaching what is found in the Bible or what is scripturally accurate, but teaching whatever they think and about the way they think something should be done. Proverbs 11, verse 9, another scripture. Proverbs 11, verse 9, "An hypocrite with his mouth destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge shall the just be delivered." A hypocrite will say something about his neighbor to someone else that's not true. A hypocrite will gossip about his neighbor, his friend in the church, and what he tells someone else is not true. That's what a hypocrite does. I heard of something a while back where someone was ignored and, in a sense, were shunned about something that had happened in their life. And the reality was the people doing this had no idea, no concept of the entire picture, but they blew it out of proportion. And they used their own analysis of what they thought had happened, which led, in effect, to a person leaving the church. Matthew 6, verse 2. Matthew 6 and verse 2. Therefore, when you do your alms, don't sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do at church or in public for that matter. They make a big pretense about their gifts to the church, or what they've given, or how they've helped someone else, and it's out there for everyone to know, which there's nothing wrong with people knowing, but it's the way they do it because they're pointing to what they did, that they may have the glory of men. That's why they do it. Someone who's giving to God doesn't seek the glory of men, because men won't do anything to them other than pat them on the back and say, well, that's really nice, and walk away and forget the entire thing. It's God that you want to give glory to you. He knows what that gift has done for his people or for his church. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward, going back to the hypocrites who let people know just because they need to assuage their own self about what they've done. Verse 5, when you pray, don't be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogue and in the corners of streets. Now, in our culture today, I don't think you won't necessarily see this happening. Most people wouldn't be caught dead on the street corner, although there are a few, and they're a little circumspect because you don't know, what's going on in their mind as to what they're doing. But you don't typically see that happening. But they may say, well, when I was praying the other day, and incidentally it was 42 3/4 minutes, just so you know. And I mean, they approach it this way. They want someone else, they want one of you to know, and one of you, in the reality is, could care less. You have your own approach to prayer. You have your own prayer life, and your concern is talking to God and talking to him in such a way that he listens to you and he hears you. They want you to know they've been talking to God, and that's how they get the reward. Verse 16, same thing. When you fast, be not as the hypocrites. Oh yeah, I really feel kind of weak today because I'm fasting. It says they disfigure their faces, they have a sad countenance, that they may appear unto men to fast. And verily I say unto you, they have their reward. Oh, didn't you see so-and-so? Didn't he look awful? Well, that's okay. He was fasting today. That explains it. That's all right. You fast because you want to get close to God. You don't care how you look necessarily. If you're fasting and you come to church, like on the Day of Atonement, we all try to have a sunny disposition because we want to feel good about what we're doing. The reality is, too, sometimes by the end of the service, and certainly by the end of the day, our faces may be down and they may be disfigured. But they're not done that way in front of a crowd. to have someone say, "Oh, you poor guy, that's so great of you to be fasting. I wish more people would do that." They have their reward. That's their reward. Matthew 16, verse 2. Matthew 16, verse 2. Christ answered and said unto them, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that's who he was talking to. He said, you say red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in the morning, sailor's warning. That's essentially where that came from in these two verses. You know the signs of the weather, and those are pretty accurate. When you have a red sky at night, usually you have good weather the next day, and conversely, if it's red in the morning, a lot of times you have a storm. You know these things make sense. You know these are true. But you hypocrites, you can look at this and you understand it, but can you not discern the signs of the times? You're okay about getting the weather right, but you're not looking at the Middle East and what's going on there, and you don't pay any attention to what's happening in Nigeria or in Iraq. And I think we're blessed to have Jim Tuck send us that update weekly. And even though every time you go through it, sometimes you wish you hadn't read it. And I always like it when he adds at the end of his introduction, and oh, by the way, have a great Sabbath. And I think after going through all the stuff that's in there about what's going on in the world, how can you have a great Sabbath? But, he's well-meaning in doing that. It's just that so many of the things in there, when you read about what's happening and you think about Matthew 24, when it talks about what prophetically is going to precede Christ's coming, it's all going on right now. It's not like when I came in the church years and years ago, we heard about all these things, but for the most part, there weren't many real live examples going on in the world. Now, it's right around you every day. Matthew 22, verse 15. Matthew 22, verse 15. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know thou art true, and teach us the way of God in truth. And they said that, obviously, with tongue in cheek, because they certainly didn't believe it. That, I don't think, was true. Maybe some of them did. But when you look at the rest of the statement, it was loaded. These next two things or principles, they said, were, however, true. Neither carest thou for any man. You don't care what men think about what you're preaching or what you have to say. And that was true. He didn't. It's not that he didn't care about men or man or woman, mankind in general, because he cared very much for them. That's why he came to offer his life. So certainly he cared for them. And you regardest not the person of man, and that just meant that it didn't make any difference who he was talking to. Your status or your position or where you were in society or on the job at work, it didn't make any difference to him. You were simply a person. So, verse 7, they ask him, okay, tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? And of course, he knew. Verse 18, he perceived their wickedness. I had a different boss, aside from the one I mentioned a little earlier. He was very smooth. He was very polished. He was always smiling. but he was the kind of person that always had a hidden agenda. I remember the first time he invited me to lunch. And I thought, we'll just go and hang out and, maybe talk shop or whatever. Maybe he was doing this just to get better acquainted with me or something like that. But after we finished eating, he said, by the way, I'd like you to help me with this particular situation. And then he told me a little bit about it and asked for my opinion, which I gave him some input, and at the end, I told him I'd help him. Any time after that, when he asked me to lunch, I knew that it would end up the same way. We weren't just going to hang out and maybe talk a little shop, but just enjoy lunch in each other's company. There was always a kicker right at the end. Some kind of a request. And at some point, after having had that happen several times, I thought and felt like saying to him, hey, let's just go to your office. Just tell me what you want me to do, what you want me to help you with in 5 minutes, and we can get it over with. And I can just go on up to the Y and play basketball or work out or do something, which is what I usually did during my lunch hour. But to go to a lunch where presumably, we're going to enjoy ourselves and this type of thing, but at the end, I always knew that little sting was going to be there. There was a reason for it. Now, there wasn't anything, certainly don't let me say there's anything wrong with business lunches, because I've been to many of them. But you always know going into a business lunch what the objective is, what the agenda, what it is that's going to be discussed. There's a business reason attached and associated with it. Sometimes you have to go away from work to discuss things. Maybe you have an open office area. Maybe there's not a conference room available, and so then you go off and go to lunch just to get away. There's a little danger in that, however, if you are talking about sensitive information, particularly as it regards to a certain employee or someone. There's always a risk that someone from work may be sitting somewhere in the vicinity and may hear what you say, and it may get back to someone else. So you have to be, careful about that. But his masquerade of the luncheon as something other than what it was particularly annoying to me. Anyway, going on with what Christ said here, he said, "Why tempt you me, you hypocrites? You hypocrites, behind your veneer is a sinister motive. You want to be able to accuse me before the Romans, so they'll imprison me for being a subversive." Now, that isn't what he said, but that's what they were trying to elicit from him, something they could take to the Roman governors and say, look, you've got this guy out here, and this is what he's saying. He's saying we shouldn't be supporting the government. But he was a little too smart for that. Show me, verse 19, the tribute. And they brought unto him a penny, and he said unto him, and of course you know this, whose image is on it? Caesar's. Then he said to them, give unto Caesar's the things which are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So he answered it in that manner. Now, how do you recognize a hypocrite? Very simply, Matthew 12, verse 34. Matthew 12, verse 34. O generation of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Sooner or later, a hypocrite will give themselves away. something is going to slip out, revealing their real motives, the motivation behind their actions. Sooner or later, it will come out. And I'll tell you this, you can count on God to reveal it. It might not happen immediately. It might happen a week from now, a month from now, a year from now. But sooner or later, it will come out. Matthew 23, verse 23. Matthew 23, verse 23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. So every time, or many times, when you see him talking about the scribes and Pharisees, you associate the word hypocrites with them because that is what they were. That's what we did, or they did. You pay tithe of mint, anise, cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law. They take a tube of mint leaves or a basket of mint leaves if they've been harvested, and they count them out very precisely, and the 10th mint leaf they set aside as the tithe, and they do it with anise seeds and cumin seeds as well. Very precisely, pick them out, take the one over here. He said, you've done these things, but you've omitted the weightier matters of the law. For example, judgment, mercy, and faith. These are heavy things. You could talk about each one of these all day. You've neglected those. You're picking around here with these little pieces of seeds. And he went on and said, these ought you to have done, talking about the weightier matters of the law that he just described, and not leave the other undone, implying they couldn't even do the minor things right. I don't know if in counting these little seeds, they got tired of them and worn out, and pretty soon they were just, randomly throwing a seed over here, and, maybe 7 or 8 or 9 would go over on the other side. It doesn't say, but it's just that the things they should have been doing, they didn't do. And the things that they were doing, they didn't do correctly. Verse 25 of Matthew 23, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Once again, that word shows up. For you make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, verse 27. For you are like unto whitened sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. So they look great outside. It's like you see sometimes when you go to a cemetery, you'll see this beautiful little marble or granite mausoleum. They're in varying sizes, but it's standing there. Beautiful looking edifice. The names of the people interred on the outside. Really looks great. But within, he says, it's full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. You don't know, how these people made their money to be able to afford something like that. You don't know. Matthew 24, verse 48. But if that evil servant shall say unto say in his heart, my Lord delayeth his coming. All these things are going on, we see the signs all around us. Jim Tuck sends us a recap every week about what's going on in the world. But you think, well, I've heard that quite a bit. It's not right now. It's almost like you hear so much of it, it doesn't have any impact. And so as a result shall begin, verse 49, to smite his fellow servant and to eat and drink with the drunken. Verse 50, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looks not for him, and in an hour that he's not aware of. In Eatonville, where we live, we're 17 miles from the base of Mount Rainier. And I sometimes, when I look at that beautiful mountain with snow on it, of course, this summer it's lost a lot of it. It's standing there so solid, and I wonder, what's going on in the core of the earth beneath us, where all of that molten lava is flowing around and churning and, gurgling and whatever it does down there. And what is it going to take? Because Mount Rainier and Mount Hood and Mount Baker and the other mountains up and down the west coast, they're all on the same line, according to my understanding. And if they all went off at the same time with no warning, can you imagine the devastating effect that would have on the west coast? Mount St. Helens, they had plenty of warning. There was a steam coming up, and the geologists were measuring all these things, and they were warning people like Harry Truman and his 28 or 29 cats up at Spirit Lake. They had warning, but they didn't heed it. They didn't pay attention to it. The signs were all there, but they didn't do anything about it. The Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looks not for him. And that's what will be happening. And in an hour that he's not aware of him. And shall cut him asunder and appoint him his portions, or his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Are we totally objective in our views? Are we open to criticism from others? Or have the attitude of my way or the highway? You can't tell me anything. I've got my own opinions about the way this part of the organization should be run, or whatever. You're not open to correction or instruction. It's my way or the highway, if our views are questioned or challenged. Luke 13, verse 13. Luke 13, verse 13, where we're told that Jesus healed a woman. And verse 14, and the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, that's what the ruler of the synagogue said, aren't there 6 days in which men ought to work? In them, therefore, and be healed, but not on the Sabbath day. It's all right to heal on 6 days of the week, but not on the Sabbath. Verse 15, and Jesus answered him and said, you hypocrite, you two-faced. Doesn't each one of you on the Sabbath day loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead him away to water? Don't you all, if you have pets, feed them on the Sabbath, water them on the Sabbath? Or do you, a Friday night before sunset, say, oh, okay, I'll set aside this dog food for the next 24 hours, and here's this bowl of water. You're on your own for the next 24 hours. Well, no, we're told to take care of our animals, and, that's what they did. They took their oxen and donkeys for food and water on the Sabbath. So if we do that to animals, if we have that care and concern for animals, verse 16, and ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan hath bound these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? What better time to do it? In verse 17, and when he said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, as well they might be. And all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. And if you saw the miracle of someone who had been infirm for 18 years and suddenly got up and didn't have a thing wrong with him, you would praise God for that, because it here truly was a miracle. I talked, I don't know, within the last year to a person I know who is not in this church area. A number of years ago, in order to justify leaving her husband and marrying another man, came up with a multitude of reasons why the marriage she was in was not valid. Years later, and this is like within the last year, I talked to her again, and she commented to me about the big mistake that she had made because of the outcome of her marriage. She said her prior analysis had been fabricated, and she finally understood why her life wasn't working. You know, we can justify just about anything to get something we want and talk ourselves into it. And all of us have a smudge of hypocrisy in that regard. When it comes to doing something that we want, very easy to justify why we're doing it. But she learned a lesson. You do that kind of thing, and you will pay a penalty for it sooner or later. It'll come back to haunt you. But it was heartbreaking to me to hear her, one, admit that she had fabricated some of the things, because I didn't realize that. And she understood why her life wasn't working. And someone like that probably thinks, well, I can take better care of his children, or I'll take better care of him, blah, 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 this type of thing. It doesn't work. The sad fact is we reap what we sow. We can play act, which is what hypocrites do. We can play act, but God sees through every bizarre and perverted twist and spin we put and use to justify our actions. God blesses and forgives us if we repent, but remember this, sometimes it's impossible to undo the damage we've done to ourselves and others in the process. And I think the prodigal son's a great example of that. You don't have to turn there, but you know, took his inheritance, spent it all, wasted it all, had absolutely nothing left, and went back to his father, who forgave him. Back at home, his brother was upset. You threw this big feast for my brother. You never did it for me. Father said, yeah, but I gave him a third of everything I owned. But you, my older son, since you're entitled to a double portion, you got the 2/3, and that 2/3 I still have, and he's not going to get any of that. That's still yours. So what's the younger son do? Well, they don't tell us, but I'm sure he had to probably work to earn whatever it was he earned, and maybe after a period of years he accumulated enough so he could do something with it. It doesn't tell us, but the inference is he wasn't getting anything more from his father. The consequences of our actions may follow us the rest of our lives. God certainly forgives us, but he doesn't necessarily change the things that have happened to you. Prisoners rank rapists and child molesters at the very bottom of the prisoner hierarchy, as it were. They have the strongest at the top, the ones no one messes with because they're lifers and they have nothing to lose, so you don't fool with them. But down at the bottom, this is a category where these people have taken advantage of people weaker than they are, and so they have a different kind of way of categorizing that. God forgives those crimes, but often there's a stigma that lasts for years, if not a lifetime. Sometimes after a sentence has been served, they're still under scrutiny. Child molesters, a notice is sent out to the area they're going to be living in to alert people. And sometimes their movements are tracked. Now, how do you get away from something like that? That's something that our society has initiated to protect the people who were injured in some way from having it happen to others of that age, young people that can't fight back, as it were. God forgives them, but there still may be a cloud over their head because society isn't as understanding and they're not as sympathetic as God is. Well, hypocrisy has destroyed marriages, has destroyed reputations, destroyed families, has caused members to leave the church. Make sure that you're not guilty of it. Jesus warns of its dangers, and we've covered them in the scriptures relating to that. He warns us to help us save our physical lives, but more importantly, he warns us to save our spiritual lives as well.